Ladies and gentlemen, this is TVP World. You're watching another edition of Break the Fake, where we debunk fake news and combat false narratives. I'm your host, Benjamin Lee, and let's get rolling. The never-ending spectacle of Vladimir Putin's theatrical threats, a production so repetitive even the Kremlin's state TV audience must be nodding off by now. After 4 hours of direct line melodrama where pre-selected Russians asked pre-approved questions and pre-written answers were delivered with scripted frowns, Putin decided he hadn't quite squeezed enough fear out of his Orishnik missile fairy tale. So, naturally, it was time for an encore. This time, through his favorite pet journalist who bravely asked the hard-hitting question, isn't World War III already underway? Now that's what I call journalism, comrades. Hard-hitting stuff right up there with asking a fish if it's wet. And Putin, ever the showman, leaned back in his oversized golden chair, adjusts his imaginary crown, and mutters something about technological duels and how Orishnik could strike not just Kyiv, but brace yourselves, and another Ukrainian city. Wow, what suspense, what unpredictability, which lucky Ukrainian city will be the subject of this month's cartoonish villain monologue. One can only imagine the technological duel Putin dreams of. On one side, Orishnik, the mythical unstoppable missile that allegedly defies physics, air defense systems, and common sense. On the other side, Ukraine's engineers with off-the-shelf drones and soldering iron, which somehow keep bypassing Russia's trillion-dollar impregnable defenses. It's like watching a Bond villain lose to a kid with a drone he bought online.
Сегодня еще спрашивали по поводу Байдена, последние дни администрации Байдена, и они не скрывают, что они вот в эти последние дни хотят вот буквально напичкать киевский режим по самое горло, там уже 1000 ракет называют. Это вообще уже выглядит как, не знаю, какая-то личная месть. Что это вообще такое? Как вы к этому относитесь? И можно ли после того, как они закопали уже просто российско-американские отношения в глубочайшую яму, хоть как-то из этого вообще выкарабкаться?
Можно все сделать, если есть желание. У нас это желание никогда не пропадало. Как бы история ни складывалась, она всегда приобретает новые очертания в зависимости от изменения ситуации. Ну вот давайте вспомним 19 век. После так называемой Крымской войны, 1855 год, да, 56-й, 55-й, когда в отношении России были введены ряд ограничений, многие на Западе писали, говорили, что вот Россия не замечает, должна была бы реагировать на какие-то несправедливости, происходящие в мире. Она не замечает этого, она изолируется, и это ставили ей вину. На что тогдашний канцлер и министр иностранных дел разослал депешу на все наши дипломатические представительства в Европе, где было написано, как реагировать на подобные заявления. Там известные были слова: «Россия не сердится, Россия сосредотачивается».
But let's talk about that World War III line. Oh Vlad, stop teasing. If you're going to start a global conflict, at least do it with some style, maybe by dramatically pressing a giant red button surrounded by flashing lights and ominous sirens. Instead, we got hours of rambling about NATO conspiracies, Poland's supposedly a villainous missile shield, and Russia's righteous struggle against, well, everyone else. The reality is painfully simple. Putin's knows his technological duel are mostly just him shadowboxing in Gilded Room, yelling threats into the void while his generals nervously check the latest budget cuts for duct tape and WD-40 to keep the Orishniks from falling apart mid-flight. Meanwhile, the Russian people get another thrilling episode of World War III teasers with Uncle Vlad, while the rest of us get a front row seat to a geopolitical sitcom where the main villain monologues so much he forgets that he's supposed to actually win the fight. And, well, the glory of the fallen Soviet Union, the good old days, Russia's favorite bedtime story and Lukashenko's most cherished wet dream. Every year, like clockwork, the Kremlin's propaganda machine dusts off its VHS tapes and broadcasts documentaries with dramatic orchestral music, slow-motion shots of crumbling Stalin statue, and teary-eyed babushkas clutching faded portraits of Brezhnev. Who destroyed our great Soviet motherland, they ask, while sipping tea from cups adorned with hammer and sickle motifs. A spoiler alert, it's always the West, Gorbachev, or some shadowy cabal of CIA agents lurking in the bushes. Now, this week's Softfest, titled USSR's Collapse in 12 Minutes, offers the same recycled narrative. We had it all: nuclear missiles, industrial glory, bread lines that stretched for miles, and a roaring economy where everyone could afford absolutely nothing. But wait, according to Lukashenko, who now moonlights as a Soviet history scholar, the USSR could have been saved if only people had believed harder and presumably clapped louder during the national anthem.
Здравствуйте, в эфире «Вести». СССР больше нет. Республики бывшей державы, за исключением Грузии и стран Балтии, их 11, учредили Содружество независимых государств.
Всем здравствуйте. 33 года назад было подписано Беловежское соглашение, то самое, что положило конец великому государству – СССР. И причины здесь называются разные. Бедственная экономика, Чернобыль, слабое руководство, заговор западных сил. И все и сразу.
Lukashenko, ever the loyal understudy to Putin, insists that Belarus and Russia have recreated a union state, a nostalgic callback to the glory days of shared misery. In reality, it's more like an arranged marriage where Belarus brings potatoes and cheap labor to the table while Russia contributes crumbling infrastructure and sanctions-induced economic doom. And let's not forget the cause of the USSR's demise. According to Kremlin bedtime lore, economic sabotage by the West, weak leadership, and probably some American-funded squirrels gnawing at Soviet cables. Anything really, except the actual reason, the sheer unsustainable dysfunction of an empire built on fear, shortages, and 5-year plans that no one understood, least of all the planners. But here's the irony. Putin and Lukashenko, with all their combined geopolitical brilliance, are trying to stitch together a second-hand version of the USSR with duct tape and patriotic ballads. The difference? Instead of a vast empire stretching from Vladivostok to Berlin, they've got the corrupt kleptocracy propped up by nukes, oil, and propaganda talk shows. So do go on, comrades. Cue the sad violin music, roll out the footage of Soviet parades, grab a tissue, and shed a tear for an empire that couldn't even manage to produce enough toilet paper. The USSR might be gone, but the absurdity of its legacy lives on in every speech by Putin, every tantrum by Lukashenko, and every propaganda documentary aired at prime time. Bravo, comrades. Encore. Now, Russia's traveling circus of mercenary has arrived in Libya, because apparently Syria wasn't chaotic enough and home in Russia. Well, who wants to deal with freezing barracks, expired rations, and loving embrace of a corrupt military bureaucracy? Instead, the sun-seeking warriors of fortune packed their rusty AKs, slapped on some sunscreen, and marched into Libya desert with the enthusiasm of tourists expecting an all-inclusive vacation. Spoiler alert, there are no beach umbrellas waiting for them in Benghazi. After their rather underwhelming performance in Syria, where Assad's regime teetered despite their best efforts and a generous supply of Russian bombs dropped on hospitals, these mercenaries decided to spice things up in Libya. Enter General Khalifa Haftar, who welcomed them like a distant cousin showing up uninvited to a family barbecue. Awkwardly tolerated, but definitely not trusted. Meanwhile, Libya's Grand Mufti Sheikh Sadiq Al-Garyani has issued a rallying cry. Get those Russians out of here! And honestly, can you blame them? Wherever Russian mercenaries go, chaos, war crimes, and a peculiar odor of unwashed uniforms seem to follow. But let's give credit where it's due. Russia's ability to export chaos on a shoestring budget is truly impressive, with no actual strategy beyond show up, shoot, and hope someone pays us. Now, these mercenaries are now playing their greatest hits in Libya. Who needs logistics or tactical planning when you've got vodka and Soviet-era nostalgia? And back in Moscow, Putin and his merry gang of oligarchs will, of course, deny any connection to those sunburned soldiers of fortune. They're not ours, they'll say, while quietly wiring Haftar some cash and chuckling over their geopolitical chessboard. After all, nothing screams we're a global superpower like renting out your army to every warlord with a half-decent oil well. One thing's for sure, Russia's global mercenary roadshow isn't stopping anytime soon. Next stop? Who knows? Maybe Sudan, maybe Yemen, or perhaps they'll pop up in Madagascar, claiming that they're there to protect democracy. Wherever they land, expect chaos, expect failure, and expect Moscow to shrug innocently while pocketing the profits. And with that, we conclude this edition of Break the Fake. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.